Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
This is the Daily History Chronicle, where we explore the moments that shaped our world and discover why they still matter today. I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and every day I get to share a piece of history that I think you'll find as fascinating as I do. On February 5th, 1885, the major powers of Europe handed one man personal ownership of a territory 76 times the size of his own country. Not a colony of Belgium, his private property. The man was King Leopold II. The territory was the Congo. And what happened next would become one of the greatest humanitarian catastrophes of the modern era. Here's what fascinates me about this moment. Leopold pulled it off by convincing the world he was a humanitarian. He presented himself as a philanthropist who wanted to bring civilization and Christianity to Central Africa, to stamp out the Arab slave trade. The international community believed him, and then behind that humanitarian facade, he built a system of forced labor so brutal that conservative estimates suggest it killed millions. The documents are there, the photographs are there, the testimony is there, and the story is largely forgotten. Picture this: Berlin, November 1884. Representatives from 14 nations are gathered for what history calls the Berlin Conference. The purpose? To divide up Africa. No African leaders were invited. These European powers were carving up a continent like a pie, and King Leopold II of Belgium, a small country with no colonial possessions, saw his opportunity. Leopold had been obsessed with acquiring a colony for years. Belgium's parliament and people had no interest in the expense and trouble of colonial adventures. So Leopold did something unprecedented. He created a front organization called the International Association of the Congo, wrapped himself in humanitarian language, and convinced the great powers that he personally should be entrusted with the Congo Basin to civilize it. On February 5th, 1885, the Congo Free State was formally established with Leopold as its sole owner and absolute ruler. Not Belgium, Leopold. He owned it the way you might own a house or a business. 900,000 square miles of Central Africa belonged to one man. Let me build the clock for you, because understanding what came next requires understanding the economics. For the first several years, Leopold's Congo was actually losing money. The infrastructure costs were enormous, and the main export, ivory, wasn't generating enough profit to cover expenses. Leopold was personally going broke. Then, in the early 1890s, John Boyd Dunlop invented the pneumatic rubber tire. Suddenly, the world needed rubber, lots of it. And the Congo's rainforests were filled with wild rubber vines. Here's where the math gets dark. Harvesting wild rubber was labor-intensive and miserable work. Workers had to go deep into the forest, slash the vines, and let the latex drip onto their skin where it would coagulate. Later they'd scrape it off, often taking flesh and hair with it. A day's quota could require 10 to 12 hours of this work. Leopold's solution was simple: force the Congolese to do it. Beginning in 1891 and 1892, he issued a series of decrees that effectively nationalized 99% of the land and its resources. The Congolese people became laborers on their own land, required to meet rubber quotas set by the state. They weren't paid, they weren't asked, they were compelled under threat of violence. The enforcement mechanism was the force publique, a military force of around 19,000 African soldiers commanded by European officers. Villages were assigned quotas. Sentries were posted to ensure compliance. If a village didn't meet its rubber quota, the force publique arrived. What happened next was documented by missionaries, journalists, and eventually by official investigators who interviewed survivors and recorded their testimony. The practice that became the symbol of Leopold's Congo was the severing of hands. Here's how it worked. Ammunition was expensive. Officers didn't want soldiers wasting bullets, so they required soldiers to account for every cartridge fired by bringing back a human hand as proof the bullet had been used to kill rather than wasted on hunting. The quotas were often impossible to meet. Rubber doesn't grow on trees. It grows on vines that take years to mature. Once an area was harvested, workers had to travel farther and farther to find more. But the quotas stayed the same. When villages couldn't meet their quotas, the force publique took hostages, usually women and children, and held them until the men delivered enough rubber. They burned villages. They killed workers who resisted or failed. And here's where the hand severing took on its own horrifying logic. Because hands were easier to collect than rubber, soldiers sometimes cut them from the living to meet their own quotas. There's testimony of baskets of smoked hands being brought to European outposts. A missionary named William Shepherd documented finding 81 hands drying over a fire at a single station. I want to be clear about something. These aren't allegations or rumors. A Swedish missionary named Evy Joblomsheim documented these practices in the 1890s. An American Presbyterian missionary, William Shepherd, published eyewitness accounts. The British consul Roger Casement conducted an official investigation in 1903 that confirmed the systematic nature of the abuses. Leopold tried to discredit each of them in turn, but the evidence kept accumulating. The scale of what happened is genuinely difficult to comprehend. Here's what we know from the records. Rubber exports from the Congo increased by over 500% between 1890 and 1901. Leopold's personal revenue from the Congo went from around 150,000 francs in 1890 to over 18 million francs by 1901. He used the money to build palaces, parks, and monuments across Belgium. The human cost is harder to quantify precisely because Leopold's administration didn't keep records of Congolese deaths, only of rubber shipments. But multiple historians, working from census data, population estimates, and contemporary accounts, have concluded that the population of the Congo fell dramatically during Leopold's rule. Estimates range from several million to as many as 10 million deaths from violence, starvation, disease, and a collapse in the birth rate caused by the disruption of normal life. Even the most conservative scholarly estimates put the death toll in the millions. Belgian historian David van Rybroek, who has spent years in the colonial archives, describes it as violence, horror, and death on an exponentially greater scale than anything that came before in the region. What strikes me about this story is how long it took for the world to respond and who finally forced that response. The first person to publicly condemn Leopold's Congo was an African-American journalist and historian named George Washington Williams. He had been a soldier, a minister, a lawyer, and a state legislator in Ohio. In 1890, he traveled to the Congo, expecting to find Leopold's humanitarian project in action. He'd even met with Leopold before his journey and been charmed by the king's vision. What Williams found on the ground bore no resemblance to what he'd been promised. He interviewed Congolese people, observed the operations firsthand, and documented what he saw. His open letter to Leopold, published in 1890, cataloged specific abuses. the use of hostages, the burning of villages, the forced labor without compensation. Williams used the phrase crimes against humanity, one of the earliest recorded uses of that term in its modern sense. Williams died of tuberculosis in 1891, just a year after publishing his letter. His accusations were dismissed by Leopold's representatives as the ravings of a disgruntled traveler. The letter was largely ignored by the international press, but others followed. William Shepard, a black American missionary, published detailed accounts with photographs. Roger Casement, the British consul, produced his devastating official report in 1903. And then came E.D. Morel. Morel was a shipping clerk in Liverpool who noticed something strange in the cargo manifests. Ships were arriving from the Congo loaded with rubber and ivory, valuable commodities worth millions. Ships were departing for the Congo loaded with guns, ammunition, and chains. Where were the trade goods? Where was the cloth, the brass wire, the beads that would normally be exchanged for such valuable exports? Where was the payment for all that rubber? Morel did the math. The only way the economics made sense was if the rubber wasn't being bought. It was being taken by force. The guns and chains weren't for protection. They were the instruments of extraction. He quit his job and spent the next decade building an international campaign against Leopold's regime. He founded the Congo Reform Association in 1904. He published newspapers and pamphlets. He gave hundreds of speeches. He recruited supporters, including Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, who wrote a book called The Crime of the Congo that sold tens of thousands of copies. Mark Twain wrote a satirical pamphlet called King Leopold's Soliloquy, imagining the king defending himself against his critics while inadvertently revealing the truth of what he had done. The Congo Reform Association became one of the first modern human rights organizations, with branches across Europe and America. They circulated photographs of mutilated Congolese children. They packed lecture halls. They pressured parliamentarians. The pressure became too great. In 1908, the Belgian parliament finally forced Leopold to hand over the Congo to Belgian government control. Leopold negotiated hard. He demanded 50 million francs for his philanthropic sacrifices and insisted on keeping his private estates within the Congo. The Belgian state paid him. Before the transfer, Leopold spent his final months systematically destroying the evidence. He ordered the burning of the Congo state archives, documents, correspondence, records of rubber shipments and punitive expeditions, all of it fed to the flames. "I will give them my Congo," he reportedly told an aide, "but they have no right to know what I did there." What survived was enough. The missionary reports, the photographs, the Casement report, the testimony gathered by reformers, the shipping manifest that Morel had analyzed. The evidence was scattered but overwhelming. Leopold died in 1909. At his funeral procession through Brussels, the crowds booed. He never set foot in Africa, not once. He ran his private empire entirely from Belgium, through administrators and military officers and rubber quotas, turning human beings into numbers on a ledger. We're still living with the consequences of what happened in the Congo. The patterns of extraction and exploitation that Leopold established shaped the Belgian colonial period that followed and the decades after independence. The Democratic Republic of the Congo remains one of the poorest countries on earth, despite sitting on vast mineral wealth. Economists have traced measurable development impacts from the rubber concession areas to the present day. But there's another consequence worth noting. The Congo Reform Movement was one of the first successful international human rights campaigns. It established a model: gather evidence, Document abuses, publish photographs, mobilize public opinion, pressure governments. That model would be used again and again throughout the 20th century. Edmund Burke wrote that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. But the Congo story suggests something more complicated. Good men and women documented what was happening for nearly 2 decades before the international community acted. Evidence alone wasn't enough. It took a sustained campaign, influential voices, and relentless pressure before anything changed. My sense is that this history matters for reasons beyond the Congo itself. Leopold's system worked because he understood something about human nature and international politics. He knew that humanitarian language could provide cover for exploitation. He knew that distant atrocities could be ignored if they weren't constantly forced into public view. He knew that profit had a way of making people incurious about its sources. These aren't lessons from a bygone era. They're patterns we can still observe. I'm Richard Backus, and this is the Daily History Chronicle. Tomorrow, we'll explore another moment that shaped our world. Until then, consider this. How do we recognize the difference between genuine humanitarianism and its performance? What would it take today to sustain attention on distant abuses the way the Congo reformers did? And when we benefit from systems we didn't create, how much are we obligated to know about how they operate? Because that's what February 5th, 1885 teaches us. Not just about the capacity for cruelty hidden behind noble language, but about how long it can persist when no one is willing to look. Thank you for your time. If you enjoyed this episode, then please subscribe. If you really enjoyed it, then please tell a friend. I hope you will join me again tomorrow for more of our shared history.